think we can start. Welcome everyone. Welcome back to the EGPP Seminar Series. We have different types of seminars in our series, and today we have a book presentation seminar, and this involves the presentation of a recent published work that is making an impact, and we're very fortunate to have two authors of a new book, Luciano Bardi and Jacopo Cellini, who will present and then will discuss with us their book on the European ambition with the subtitle, The Group of the European People's Party and the European Integration. It has been published recently. It is co-authored with a multidisciplinary group under the auspices of the EPP and in collaboration with the historical archives of the EU here at the EUI. And we will be able to engage with them in a debate on their findings and the core argument. Now, the book is receiving a lot of attention and was debated at the European Parliament recently. And we are able to continue that debate. Maybe I can say in a more critical way, since we will not have the EPP groups, the group members with us today, and on a more academic level. So thank you very much, Jacopo and Luciano, for accepting our invitation, for being with us today, for presenting your research. Unfortunately, we continue to be fully online, given that Tuscany is reverted in orange zone, but this still doesn't make it possible to meet in person. It will, however, nonetheless be an engaging and stimulating seminar. In terms of format, Jacopo first and Luciano will give an initial presentation of about 40 minutes, and then we go straight to Q&A, and both authors obviously will take questions and comments. Thank you all for being with us today, especially to our teachers. Jacopo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daniele, for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss this book, in which I was involved as a research assistant throughout the project. And I thought I'd give you first a quick overview of how this project, the project that produced this book, started, and then we'll get straight into the contents. Let me share the screen with you because we have a presentation. Okay, you can see that.
Yes.
So the project began in 2017 when the Alcide De Gasperi Research Center of the European University Institute answered to the EPP Group's call for a study on the group's impact on European integration. And this topic had not been properly addressed by the academic literature yet, and it was also, as Danielle was mentioning, at the crossroads of different disciplines. This is why we decided to set up a multidisciplinary team of scholars with historians, political scientists, experts in European studies, who had an academic background and research experience in history, political science, law, political sociology. And they so applied a multifaceted methodological strategy consisting of historical approaches, single case studies, and comparative methods. The EPP group was then analyzed across time and at important historical junctures, but also, and this is an important part of the book, as we'll see, in relation to other political groups. The research design has been conceived in order to provide the readers, that meant in our case both, of course, the scientific community, but also wider general audience, provide them with a multifaceted analysis of the political trajectory of the EPP group in the European Parliament. So to do that, we opened the book with a historical chapter authored by Wolfram Kaiser, which discusses the history of the EPP Group in the European communities. So from its origins as the Christian Democratic Group in the 1950s until the early 1990s, until the Maastricht Treaty. This is not a simple chronological reconstruction of the group's history, which, by the way, had already been done by a former EPP Group official, Pascal Fontaine, in a book that was published some 10 years ago, I guess. But instead, the chapter starts by retracing the group's cultural and political lineage, which lies in the Christian democratic transnational networks in between the two world wars, but especially after the Second World War. Then it moves on to analyze the group's composition and internal governance from 1958 to 1992, as well as its evolving relationship with the party, with the European People's Party, and with other political groups in the European Parliament. And one element that emerges from this analysis, and that will be a recurring theme throughout the book, is the importance of the informal cooperation between among the largest political groups in the European Parliament, in particular, in the case of this chapter, between the EPP and the socialists in the 1980s. The study ends with an analysis of selected moments and areas of the EU policymaking, with a view of evaluating the EPP Group's impact and to establish the possible existence of path dependencies, that is, the presence of political, organizational, and ideational legacies that have influenced the group's behavior in the last 40 years. Let me go on with a quick overview of the chapters. The second chapter, authored by a political scientist, Carl Magnus Johansson, explores the role of the EPP Group within the constitutionalization process of the European Union, of the European communities, and then of the European Union. So the focus is on the so-called season of the treaties, opened by the Single European Act in 1987 and closed by the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007. Well, closed at least for now and the foreseeable future, since it's unlikely that the approaching conference on the future of Europe will bear fruits in terms of treaty reforms. In treaty reform, the chapter was conceived as a case study analysis of the treaty reforms that have been successfully completed between 1987 and 2007, plus an attempted one, the Constitutional Treaty of the early 2000s. And its goal was to document the role of the EPP Group and its network in the context of treaty negotiations. Therefore, in particular, in the various intergovernmental conferences where treaty reforms were discussed. One important result of this study, which is also confirmed by other chapters in the book, concerns the importance of the EPP network in exerting an influence in the treaty negotiations, and therefore in shaping the institutional environment of the European Union. The network included the group and the party at European level, but also national parties and EPP representatives in national governments, in a dynamic that needs to be studied by taking account both formal and informal relationships between the various protagonists. The third chapter, authored by a historian, Karine Germain, focuses on four macro areas of the EU internal policies. So agriculture, as you see, economic and monetary policy, social policy, and the environment and environmental policy. given, of course, the range of the EU internal policies, we had to make a choice about which areas we would investigate. And the rationale for this choice was that they were of strategic importance for the EU since the beginning, or in more recent times, like in the case of the environment, but also they were of strategic importance for the EPP specifically, because they touched on core values of its political culture, as well as on the interests of its electorate. Indeed, for instance, one traditional political feature of the EPP was the effort to reconcile economic liberalization and social policy measures intended to moderate the impact of such liberalization, especially for particular interest groups, like, for instance, the farmers. Well, the analysis in the study highlights in particular the role of EP committees in advancing legislation, and more generally how the empowerment of the European Parliament was a paramount goal of the group, seen as a necessary step to further European integration and make progress in all the policy areas, and we'll come back to this. The importance of EP committees and, of course, of group representatives work within them is also confirmed by the fourth chapter, authored by a political scientist, Wojciech Gagatek. The chapter deals with the EU, in this case with EU external policies, and in particular foreign policy, development policy, trade policy, common commercial policy, and EU enlargement. On this subject, the literature was particularly scarce, also because most of these areas are characterized by an intergovernmental approach, and therefore it's more difficult to isolate and analyze the impact of the European Parliament and of the political groups within it. Nonetheless, the chapter presents interesting findings on the nature of political competition in the field of EU external relations, and on the impact of Eastern enlargement on the group's position. This is more generally another common thread in the course of the book, that is the effects of the EU enlargements on the group's organizational structure, as well as on its political strategy and culture. This is one of the themes, for instance, that are addressed by the fifth chapter, authored by Luciano Bardi, but he will talk about it in a more articulate way in a few minutes. Now I would like to introduce you for a while on the operational aspects of this research, which relate, by the way, to my role as a research assistant in this project, before finally explaining the choice of the title. So the main result of the research work has been the creation of repertoires of sources and data that facilitate the study of the EPP Group over the last 40 years, since the first direct elections of the European Parliament. We created a series of data sets, starting by gathering the names and partisan affiliations between 1979 and today, so until the current legislature, of all the EP presidents, the vice presidents, the committee chairs and vice chairs, the delegation chairs and vice chairs. This data have been useful for all the chapters, but especially for Luciano Bardi's analysis of the EPP Group institutional relevance, that is the ability to obtain relevant institutional position in the European Parliament. By the way, the calculation of the institutional strength within the EP was not limited to the EPP, but was extended to other political groups for comparative purposes, and especially to those belonging to the core, so the socialists and the liberals, whose informal cooperation has historically contributed to strengthen the European Parliament within the EU institutional framework. But Luciano will talk about this in more detail later. Moreover, we collected data on the national delegations within the group to analyze the inter-delegation balance. And we developed a data set concerning the EPP Group membership in selected EP committees, which have then been analyzed in the chapters on the EU's internal and external policies. Data concerned the distribution of the group representatives within the committees, but also their voting behavior on relevant topics. Also in this case, data were not limited to the EPP, but they included also other political groups. So this was one side of the research work, gathering and analyzing data on political groups in the European Parliament. But there was also another side concerning the historical sources. And well, historians of Christian democracy, like myself, I guess maybe not so many historians are present today, so it's useful to know that one of the major problems facing the scholars is the fragmentation of sources between different archives and different countries. This research project could count on the cooperation between the EPP Group archives in Brussels, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Germany, in St. Augustine, where most of the sources of international and European Christian democracy are held, including those of the EPP Group in the original. And our historical archives of the European Union in Florence, the Villa Salviati, which hold the archives of the EU institutions and therefore also the papers of the European Parliament, among others. So we were able to digitize hundreds of documents, and this digitization proved useful for a research team that was spread out between different countries. And many of these documents, in particular from the EPP Group, were made available for the first time. For instance, the presidency and the bureau meetings, the political notes for the plenary. Some of the files have been marked confidential, which means that they are not yet available for all the researchers, but they were shared with the research team within the context of this project. So, of course, they gave a special insight on the group's functioning that couldn't be gained by relying only on published sources. And this allowed for a more nuanced analysis. All the chapters rely on these sources, most notably Wolfram Kaiser's, whose study, as I was mentioning, also deals with the history of the group before 1979, but also the chapters on the EU internal policies and on its constitutionalization. Well, we could also make use of another kind of historical testimonies, that is on oral sources. All the authors interviewed current and former EPP members, the EPP Group's support staff, as well as other observers and experts, so as to obtain an eyewitness account on some key moments in the history of the group, but also some insights on its day-to-day functioning. And these interviews could also be integrated with those included in the oral history program of the Historical Archives of the European Union, which collects the voices of European politicians and officials whose testimonies have been used for different projects on the history of European integration that have been published in recent years. So to sum it up, this was one accomplishment of the research project, the creation of a series of repositories that collect data and sources of the EPP Group, but also on other political groups in the European Parliament. And this collection helped in making a step forward in the scientific literature on the European political parties, which prior to this had rarely relied on primary sources for the analysis of European political groups. Okay, so I guess I have another 5 minutes, yes. So finally, why the European ambition? The title of the book that I have here, by the way, this is the book which was published by Nomos in August last summer. The title of the book recalls an expression that was used by the then EPP Group chair Wilfried Martens when he referred to European political union in his speech at the 13th EPP Congress held in Brussels in 1999. But in the EPP Group's general conduct and specific actions, the European ambition is more than a simple idea of about European integration. And well, in fact, it consists of different but related values or ideals, objectives, and means or instruments. Let's start briefly from the values. These are Christian values, principles and ideals, which are understood in a universalistic manner and more specifically in a supranational way. By the way, a subject that is touched upon throughout the book and that would warrant further studies and that is particularly dear to my research interests concerns how the Christian democratic political culture has changed over the last 40 years as new member parties joined the group after successive enlargements or after structural changes to the member states' political systems. Often the new member parties didn't come from a Christian democratic cultural background. So the negotiation of a new shared political platform is something that can and should be studied also from a historical perspective. But the European ambition is not only made of values, but also of political goals. Well, the main institutional objective of the EPP was the building of a European federal state through a gradual approach. So true to the original strategy for European integration, which is well known, it was a combination of the functionalist approach of Jean Monnet and the supranational approach epitomized by Robert Schuman. While the creation of the federal state was the ultimate declared goal, there is also an intermediate institutional objective, which is also a means of achieving the primary one, and that is the institutional strengthening and empowerment, as I was mentioning earlier, of the European Parliament. And this strategy has been pursued rather consistently by the group over the last 40 years and with some degree of success. Finally, the pursuit of the objectives of the EPP Group's European ambition requires, it's one final finding that I want to mention, this book requires a two-dimensional strategy involving organizational means and a political strategy. The organizational instruments of the strategy consists of the achievement and maintenance by the EPP Group of a numerical prevalence in the European Parliament and of a pervasive presence in all member states. This is reflected in the EPP Group's often successful efforts to attract sister parties in new member states across successive enlargements, although this can potentially lead to the problems I was mentioning before concerning the heterogeneity of the new parties' cultural and political backgrounds. The other political facet of this strategy, pursued by the EPP Group, was aimed at the achievement of hegemony in the European Parliament through an assertive activism and political alliances leading to the creation of an understanding or of an alliance of the historically more important political groups within the European Parliament, including the Socialists and the Liberals, to start with. But this particular aspect has been especially studied by Luciano. So I would leave him the floor to address, among other things, also this particular issue. So thank you for now, and I will stop the sharing of the screen, and I give the floor back to Daniele or directly to Luciano.
Yes, I can give the floor directly to Luciano. Do you need to share your screen?
Yes, I do. I am going to do that now. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Daniele, for the invitation and for the opportunity to present the book in a more academic context than we have already done with the EPP Group. And I will start with giving you a structure of my presentation, which is limited to my chapter, as Jacopo already indicated. I'm not going through these 7 items one by one, because otherwise I will use up all of my time just doing that. I'll give you a few seconds to take it all in, and I will proceed then to the first of these 7 parts, parties and party groups at the European level. We study parties and party groups at European level mostly because they are an important element of the discussion on democracy in the European Union. 40 years after the first direct elections of the European Parliament, an assessment of democracy in the European Union is necessary. Actually, it's been necessary for more than that. We've been talking about democracy in the European Union since I've been studying the European Union, which is more than 40 years. So I think this is long overdue. And the criteria for the assessment of how democratic the European Union is are inevitably drawn from existing models and notions of democracy. And these are provided by the member states' political systems, that is, by what we consider normal democracies. And in our understanding, at least academically speaking, of what is normal, we really consider party government systems in which organizationally integrated parties perform all essential political functions. How are these functions performed? According to Katz and Mayer, political parties present 3 different organizational phases. And these need to be equally effective and well integrated with each other for best functional performance. What happens at the European Union level? The 3 phases, which are called by Katz and Mayer, party on the ground, party in central office, and party in public office, present peculiar characteristics. The party on the ground, which is, I would say, the backbone of national level parties, never really developed an effective membership because of competition coming from national parties for the performance of the crucial functions of a democratic system, based on parliamentary representation. And that is political recruitment, mobilization, in some cases, even politicization of issues. And of course, articulation of demand. I could go on. What about the party in central office? The party in central office is the central organization of parties, And it has been much improved after regulation 2004/2003, the so-called Euro-Party Statute, but is still unable to dictate a party line. Many member states still inspire party lines in intergovernmental meetings. It's the old problem of the European Union. There are two institutional chains. One is supranational and the other one is intergovernmental. And the intergovernmental one certainly has a predominance over the supranational one. And of course, national parties which operate in the intergovernmental one take advantage of the more efficient system in which they work. What about a party in public office? It is limited to the parliamentary component. The policymaking governmental component of the party in public office is really non-existent. The Spitzenkandidaten idea was intended to change this, but the 2019 election was a setback. So party groups in the European Parliament are still the most developed and visible component and the one on which we will concentrate our attention. And we'll do that by just looking at how big these groups are. And obviously, the most important dynamic within the European Parliament is the evolution of the European People's Parties and the S&D, the socialists basically, vote shares, and actually here I should say seat shares in the European Parliament. There was a predominance of the socialists between 1979 and 1994, originated by the inability of the EPP to obtain seats in the UK and Denmark in 1979, and later this was strengthened by the new accession countries, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, where the socialists fared much better than the European People's Party. This changed from 1999 onwards. In the 1990s through the early 2000s, large national non-Christian democratic delegations joined the EPP. The most important ones were the UK Conservatives and Forza Italia. Then from 2004 and 2014, the EPP showed much greater ability to incorporate national parties coming from the new member states. And of course, this is the era in which the European Union experienced its widest expansion. And there was a change in all of this with the last two elections, where the major, most important traditional political groups declined, but the EPP was still able to maintain a leading position. We can see all of this in this chart, where you can see how important the two major parties are compared to the others, and the dynamic I illustrated before with the EPP being second to the socialists up until 1999, and then with a change after that date. All the other groups, of course, have ups and downs, but with less important and dramatic implications. The literature has concentrated on the institutional development of European Parliament's political groups by looking at cohesion and inclusiveness. Cohesion is measured to the degree of agreement in roll call votes. There is some disagreement on how this is really an effective indicator of cohesion, but this is what the literature offers. And since there is a lot of literature on that, we did not concentrate on this. We limited ourselves to citing those who have done this work. Attina was the first one who did it, and then Simon Hicks and a number of his colleagues continued. Inclusiveness, on the other hand, is another important indicator, and actually another important characteristic of the groups. This is something on which we have concentrated more directly ourselves. And the next tables illustrate the number of members within the party groups, the number of countries represented, as well as the structure of the EP party system. I will go through this very quickly, but let's just look at the 2019 column here. And we can see there are three groups that have a very strong presence in many European countries, member states. Here we still have 28 because, of course, Great Britain still participated in the 2019 elections. And there are three more groups that are present in half or more than half of the member states. Another important element here, which gives us a measure of how European these groups are, is the size, the relative size of the largest delegation. And as you can see, the three major groups, EPP, socialists, and liberals, now called Renew Europe, and actually the left as well, the European United Left, have largest delegations that are not too overpowering. This, of course, is important because it forces more genuine European cooperation within the groups. And finally, the Euro party system indicators. This is a rather complicated table, so I'm not going to try to go through it in great detail. Just let me point out that although we have now about 200 national party delegations within the European Parliament, whereas we only had about 55 in 1979, we still have the same number of political groups, including the non-attached. I think this is remarkable because it testifies to a great ability by the party groups to incorporate newcomers. Another important indicator, though, is which, of course, in normal democracies, we like to see as having the lowest possible values, is the effective parties index, which testifies again to the ability of the party system to consolidate itself. Well, for the first 7 parliaments, there was an ability of the party system to consolidate itself, not really by decreasing in value, by decreasing the value of the effective parties index by very much, but by keeping more or less at the original levels, which again, with the increasing number of national delegations I mentioned before, is in itself an achievement. But in the last two elections, this actually had has marked a reversal, and this is something we'll have to worry about in the future and really take a closer look at in our future analysis. What does this mean? It means that there is greater fragmentation within the European Parliament, and this, of course, can make the progress of the institution more difficult. One positive indicator comes from the fourth double column. The reason why I have double columns is that there is an important dynamic during a parliamentary terms, and I don't have time to get into it now, but this calls for looking at values at the beginning of the term and at the end. So you will forgive me for not having replaced these tables, these columns, but if you can take a quick look yourselves, you can see how interesting it is to observe that some of these numbers decrease or increase dramatically within the same parliamentary term. What is important in this third set of columns is that the numbers are now again very low. This means that potentially non-European in terms of their internal dynamics groups are declining in importance. And finally, we have another negative set of data, which comes from the fourth column, where we can see that the total seats of the three major groups that somehow represent the core of the party system are declining. Now,
Luciano, how long do you think you will need?
Well, I started 15 minutes ago. I think I need another 5.
Okay.
So we are now looking at the institutional relevance index. I think how this was calculated is pretty complex, and I have a whole big page of information here. We can come back to it if we need to discuss it, if anybody has questions about it. And as we can come back to the weighting of the institutional positions within the European Parliament. What we have now is another part of our analysis, which tries to assess whether electoral strength predicts institutional relevance. In theory, it should, because institutional positions within the European Parliament are attributed through the Don't method, which is highly proportional. In reality, there is some leeway in the decisions as to who gets what positions, and therefore we find that the core groups, the EPP, the Socialists, and the Liberals, institutional relevance is always better than their electoral performance. So they get better institutional positions than their counterparts. And again, the three core groups institutionally were stronger than one would predict from their seat share. The EPP is also the most resilient. Its loss of 12% of the seats in the last couple of elections resulted only in an 8% decline of its institutional relevance. And here you can see what the relationship is in this regression with socialists and EPP being always above the regression line, as well as the liberals, whereas the other groups sometimes almost fall off the floor of this graph. And again, you can see how the graph that illustrates the institutional relevance of the three main groups reflects the graph that we use to illustrate the electoral and parliamentary strength, although there are some differences. Here I will show it only for the EPP, where you can see the international, the institutional relevance score is always higher, only in one case it's about the same, than the their share of seats. We made a comparison with the data collected by Votewatch Europe, and we find a very similar pattern with our own, where the only difference is at number 4, where the PIS got into a position which one would expect to be belong to parties from one of the three core groups. I will skip the internal balance of the European People's Parties to come to the conclusions. The European People's Party group's trajectory has been characterized by fluctuations in its importance and influence, as well as significant changes in its composition and organizational structure. The European Union enlargements have significantly affected the EPP group. From the beginning, the accession of Denmark and the UK relegated the EPP to a subordinate position vis-a-vis the socialist group for the first 4 elected terms. The EPP had been the most important group in the non-elected parliament. Then the fragmentation caused by successive enlargements contributed to the decline in the relative size of the historically strongest national delegations, including the German one. And this, of course, has somewhat limited the ability of the EPP group to act consistently and coherently in the last 5 to 10 years. And of course, this is a result of the increasing heterogeneity in terms of history, ideology, and values of the newly incorporated national delegations. Overall, the process of absorption of former Eastern Bloc delegations has profoundly diluted the original identity and values of the group. This is potentially creating the conditions for significant changes in the group's political positioning and strategic outlook. Now, with Orban actually having left the EPP, there may be some slowing down of this process. Anyway, a weakening of the current understanding with the socialists and liberals on institutional and strategic decisions is certainly possible and perhaps already underway. But these difficulties notwithstanding, the group is still displaying remarkable resilience and ability to respond to all the ideological, organizational, and political challenges it has been called to face. Now, having said this, what can we see as future developments? Even if the three core groups, with the addition of the Greens, don't seem to be single-minded about many important things, what we see is still a strong difference between these four and the Eurosceptic groups. So this is a dynamic that, albeit problematic, I don't see as changing in the near future. And finally, the other development that might be possible is a change from what we can call institutional coalitions to political coalitions. By institutional coalitions, we can mean coalitions that have the main purpose of maintaining the efficiency and the strength of the European Parliament as an institution. These are the coalitions that the three core groups, liberals, socialists, and Christian Democrats, have given birth to gave birth to in 1979 and have continued throughout the history of the elected parliament. I think now is the time to move to political coalitions. These groups have shown that they can have convergences on a number of policy areas, and only if they manage to present themselves with common candidates and common programs at the next elections, we can hope for a strengthening of the European Union's democracy, not only democracy, but also of the ability of the European Union to respond to challenges that, as we know now painfully through our experience with the COVID, and prior to that with the financial and economic crisis, can present themselves without any warning. Okay, I'm sorry if I went over the time I was allotted, but thank you very much. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciano, and thank you, Jacopo. We can open now the floor for questions and comments. I should say that I'm very happy that we have a book of this nature that stresses the interdisciplinary nature also of what the EGPP does. We had sessions that were more on the sociological side, this one that incorporates a historical aspect. We will also have sessions that are more based on juridical studies. So EGPP is not only political science, and so I welcome very much this interdisciplinary approach of your book. Anya, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I have 3 questions, and the first one is just methodological. Jacopo said in the beginning that you have analyzed in how far the EGPP had a strong role in shaping treaty negotiations, and you said that you had a methodology for comparing different with other party groups, and I would have liked to hear a little bit more about how you did that and how you conducted this research. And then I was wondering if you had some indications on how this role changed over time. I mean, you've called the book The Big European Ambition. I'm wondering, is there still this European ambition? And that links also to the last point that Luciano presented. You said for the democratic viability or the social political structure of the European Union, it would be good that we get from institutional coalitions to more political coalitions. So what you and well, that was kind of a normative argument. I would like to ask you, what do you see as a reason behind such a movement to happen? Isn't it simply because the support for a stronger federal Europe and a stronger European Parliament has diminished, in particular, for example, within the subgroup of German MEPs in the European People's Party? This is something that I get a little bit out of my own research. Thank you very much.
Yes, maybe I'll
How do we go?
Oh,
you go.
okay. Or do you want to gather other questions, Daniele?
Go ahead.
We can take one question at a time.
Yeah, just very briefly about your first question, Anya. Well, the role of the group in the treaty negotiations was addressed mainly on a qualitative level. So we didn't have we couldn't do quantitative studies, but instead it was especially explored in the chapter, of course, on the constitutionalizations of the EU, and so it was intended as a case study and analysis. And in order to understand how the whole network of the EPP group, which included, of course, not only the group, but the party, and also in particular the EPP representatives in national governments, work together. And we find that, for instance, at least in two instances before the negotiations for the Maastricht and during the negotiations for the Maastricht Treaty and during the Constitutional Treaty of the early 2000s, this network worked very well. They had many formal and informal meetings before treaty negotiations where a common position of the EPP network could be shaped and then presented within the intergovernmental conferences. Of course, the case of the constitutional treaty negotiations was different, even if in the end it didn't work out. But the European Parliament was more directly involved, so we were able to see a more pronounced role of the group. But then we study in a qualitative way how the network, the informal relationship within this network worked in the case of treaty negotiations. And if I may add this, we found out that the network, the networking of the EPP is useful to study not only in the context of treaty negotiations, which is sort of expected, but also in policy making. We found that in many instances in the policy areas that we study, the networking of the EPP also with other non-political groups and interests, it's a factor that had an impact in policy making and in advancing legislation. So this is an aspect that needs to be further investigated.
Thank you.
Dan?
Yes. Would you like to add something?
Well, there was one question that was specifically asked to me, and on comparative, well, how do we do it? I mean, we could not really analyze the. Let me share if I can. I can't find the button anymore. Okay, for some reason you appear and hide my share the screen button, Danielle. Okay, let me try this again. I don't want. Okay. As you can see by these graphs, we could not study the EPP if not comparatively. So what we did, we collected the same data for all of the groups, which of course is good in a way, because it would be our hope to continue this kind of study as a series. And a lot of the data we already have. So the problem then, the challenge there would be to say something different and original, but more or less what we have done is really a comparative analysis of party groups in the European Parliament. The focus was on the EPP because that was what the book was all about, but certainly it is a comparative study, at least, and not only in my chapter, but also in the other chapters. What the two chapters on policy did was analyze the positions of the EPP group vis-a-vis the positions of the others. So that's my answer to that. On the institutional versus political coalitions, yes, it is a normative statement, but it comes not so much from something that I would recommend, but I hate to use this expression, but there's no other way to put it, my insider knowledge of what the groups are thinking now. I have worked with the EPP for this project, but I've been working with the FEPS, the Foundation for the European Progressive Studies, which is the socialist one, for many, many years. And both are now trying to find ways to offset the setback that was experienced in 2019 with this Spitzenkandidaten strategy. Okay, so this is something I am witnessing. The institutional coalition, which was at the basis of the strategy in 2014 and 2019, did not work. We now, they say, need a different kind of coalition, and which I am calling political coalition. You know, political scientists hear what the politicians say, and then they make it theirs for academic recycling. Okay, and then present a candidate with the strength of a common program, limited because they don't agree on everything, but something that no commission candidate has had so far. And this, of course, could go great lengths towards the parliamentarization of the European Union. Because now, yes, the parliament has a so-called power of confidence, but it's really not based on politics. It's based more on the ability to censor unethical or incompetent behavior. Now they could say, hey, really, this is our program, you have not respected it, we can kick you out. I'm sorry, but I didn't hear what you said about your own research on Germany. I didn't catch it. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, it was just that in my own research, it seems to me that within the CDU, CSU, so the conservative,
Yes.
two conservative party groups, the support for strengthening of the European Parliament is declining, but that is not.
Well, I can see that, but these things change, they shift, and what happened with the dilution of Christian democratic identity, the German delegations became more skeptical than in the past. And it is not as hegemonic. Also because, like I was able to show before, the relative size of the German delegation, which is almost always the largest, has gone down. Which in a sense, though, might make the importance of what you have seen in Germany less important. Okay, so I think this is it.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Lorenzo?
Yes, thank you, Daniele, and thank you, Luciano and Jacopo, for the great presentation. I have maybe for now a couple of questions / comments. Maybe the first is more for Jacopo in the sense that came to me while you were giving your part of the presentation, and the other one maybe more for Luciano. So the first one would be what really struck me from your presentation, not only of what you presented today, but the whole research project, is the huge amount of new textual data that, as far as I have understood, you have produced and come up with and dug out of the archival sources. So in a sense, this is not more of a question of what you're doing now, but what are the avenues for further research on this? Because given that you have, again, dug up so much new textual information, I was wondering if you have an idea for some potential text analysis of this huge amount of textual sources. You know, what frames and narratives the EPP group and also other group have can be elicited from documents. And this, in a sense, also links to one of the last points of the part that actually Luciano discussed. So this idea that the absorption of the Eastern enlargement has, in a sense, diluted the Christian values of the EPP group. I was wondering, does this reflect in the text that the EPP group has produced over the course of the time? So in this sense, this is really like the idea is that really there's a lot that can come out of this text data. The second point, the second question, maybe more for Luciano. I know it's kind of an unfair question in a sense, because of course you focus on the EPP group within the European Parliament rather than the European political party. But since at the end of the day, what you look at with your indicators are, as you name them, indicators of the, let's say, the transnational nature of the Euro party system, how really accurate is the picture if you only, let's say, look at the ex post moment? So how much, diffuse among countries, how integrated is the European People's Party group? But what happens ex ante, so before the election? So how many parties actually are affiliated to the European Party when they campaign? Do they have relationship in the past with the Spitzenkandidaten? Do they have European references in their logo, in their political communication, in the material that they put forward in the electoral campaign? Because I mean, of course, the European level is a kind of a tricky one, in the sense that the party in public office is much stronger than the party in central office, and that holds for the EU level. In the national level, usually it's the other way around. So of course, it makes sense to focus more on the European party groups within the parliament rather than the European parties. But I was wondering if more can be said also on this regard. Because, for instance, I also happen to be working on a project that looks at the Europeanization of electoral ballots. So actually, in how many electoral ballots across Europe you have European reference. And also in this regard, I found some backwarding trends, some backsliding between 2014 and 2019. So, I mean, in European ballots across Europe, there are less references to both European party groups and European parties in the electoral ballots rather than there was in 2014. And this is probably linked to the demise of the Spitzenkandidaten procedure. But vice versa, other types of transnational associations, such as DiEM25 or Volt, are actually more present now than they were in the past. So maybe, if we look also at the European party system from the part of the political parties, we can see that this Euro party system is kind of developing in a certain way, which is maybe less power to parties and more power to other types of transnational association. Then I would have maybe some more specific question on the institutional relevance index, but we had already the chance to discuss this when you presented the similar research at our conference, annual conference a couple of months ago. So maybe we'll keep this for a later discussion if there is time. But thanks again for the great presentation to the both of you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Luciano or Jacopo? If you would like to share.
We reverse.
Okay.
Okay, well, Yes, Lorenzo, you're right. Your question is very unfair. Why didn't you ask me why I didn't study preference voting? Why didn't you ask me? There are so many aspects. Why didn't you ask me why I did not discuss the transnational lists? Of course, there are many other ways to look at this. We have limited time, limited resources, and limited funds to do all of this. I appreciate though what you're saying, having of course answered in in what I hope was taken as an ironic tone. After all, I think you and I were the first ones to study European ballots together. So I I can only agree on what you said about looking at how the national elections are shaped. It is something actually we might do in the next studies if we do continue with this project, as we hope we are. Like I mentioned before, a lot of what can be said about all political groups has already been said in the book on the EPP. So we can find new angles and new aspects in the new in the next projects if we manage to develop them. More or less, I think this is what you were saying. The other question was more aimed at Jacopo. So please confirm that I have answered your question, Lorenzo. I'm not sure I have.
Yes, from my side, thank you, Lorenzo, for the question. Well, it's true. We analyzed. We had the possibility to look at a huge amount of documents, and well, of course, they are very useful to study the building, the formation of policy preferences throughout the EPP Group's history, and so if one's interested in a particular policy areas, we had really so many documents that we couldn't even get into. We were focused on those that were pertaining to the policy areas that we were addressing, but there is much more in the archives, of course. And but I would guess that the more interesting avenue for further research, as you were asking, is in fact one theme that we are talking about now in this presentation. So how the cooperation, the more formal or informal, was this an informal cooperation or altogether a political alliance between the largest political groups developed, how and when it originated. This is something that cannot be studied only by looking, of course, at the voting behavior and more quantitative data, but needs also to be studied from a historical perspective. And this can be done by looking at the archives. By the way, we have the opportunity, we had historical archives. We not only have the opportunity within this project to look at the EPP Group archives, but we do have also the archives of the socialists, of the liberals, and partly of the Greens. So it's something that we can study also here at the European University Institute. So how this cooperation between the core groups developed, and what were the most important historical junctures or the most important events that prompted this cooperation, and of course to analyze its ups and downs. And also another interesting avenue is something that you mentioned, so the possible dilution, of course, of the Christian democratic identity when the new member parties, of course, joined, in particular from Eastern Europe. Well, yes, this is something that can be studied, of course, by looking at formation of political programs before the elections. But also more generally, I think that one of the more interesting research questions that could be asked is can the the slogan of the deepening versus widening or if they can go together or not. The EPP claimed that it could go together. So the deepening of European integration with the widening of European integration and with the accession of new countries. But this is something that has proven difficult over, in particular, in the last 15 to 20 years. From the archives, we can gather how this process was prepared, if it was prepared also with a political consciousness that it was going to be difficult, and if and how the process in the end was successful, and if this is something that remains on the political priorities of all the political groups, but in this case of the EPP in the future. I think that this is a very interesting research questions that could be further studied.
Thank you, Luciano and Jacopo. Any more questions? Otherwise, I would take the opportunity and ask myself a couple of questions, make a couple of comments, if I may. I mean, of course, it's a very rich book, so there would be so many things to discuss. I'll just focus on a couple of aspects that maybe you can react to. So the data you presented, Luciano, the tables, I found them very, very interesting. I would maybe not interpret them exactly like you do. You show a pattern of fragmentation of the effective number of parties over time. I think these data would need to be interpreted in the light of what goes on also at the national level. Because if you have an increase in fragmentation at the national level and an increase in fragmentation at the level of the European Parliament or party groups, that to me points to just a secular movement, an evolution of party systems in general that is not specific to something that is happening in the European Parliament. Well, nonetheless, I found that data very interesting because, I mean, it points to first of all, it points to a large literature on representation. And in a way, the data, the correlations that you show between the electoral results, the distribution of seats, and the institutional relevance index, that there is a chain of delegation that is almost perfectly proportional. And I find that result quite intriguing because it points to much more than just the European People's Parties or what happens from election to election, but it points to a model of democracy that Powell, he would define this a proportional type of democracy. It's not a majoritarian type of democracy. Leipart would have spoken that this is clear indicators of a consociational type of political system, not a Westminster type of political system. And to me, this, I mean, of course it is. I mean, it's a compound democracy. Many religions, many historical trajectories, languages, etc., etc., etc. And yet, very often, you said we judge democracy from what we know at the national level, but the national level doesn't have one type of democracy. I mean, if we were to compare this to the Westminster model, obviously, it doesn't have the same kind of visibility, the same account of accountability, and so on and so forth. But were you to compare it to a consociational democracy, then I don't think the increase in the number of effective parties, increase in fragmentation would be surprising at all. So I think there is a bit more space for interpretation of the data, and probably this is unfair too, but we're all unfair today. It goes beyond just the meaning of the data goes beyond just one party group. Then the second point is about this.
Oh, that was one point.
That was one point. The other point is about the values. And this goes back also about the session we had some weeks ago. I struggled a bit in the book with I mean, I find it quite uncritical on the values. And not uncritical because obviously that there can be preferences towards a certain value, but the book points to freedom, democracy, human rights, free trade and opportunity, cohesion, identity, subsidiarity principle, all very nice things. And yet we know that at least Catholicism has a bit an ambiguous relationship with democracy, historical, especially in the aftermath of World War II, where it had to deal with what happened before World War II. It still has it in many ways, and you spoke about the enlargement, you spoke about Orban. It still has a bit this difficult relationship, but it's clear that Christian democracy, even as a concept, tries to bring together to make a compatibility between Christian values and democracy, which was not obvious previously. And this points to a cultural dimension. I mean, it points to a democratic dimension, first of all, but also to a cultural dimension where, I mean, many of these, the values that maybe, I mean, I'm thinking about women's position in society or the right to vote and so on, to a cultural dimension of left-right, let's say left-right, just to simplify, which is very salient today. Maybe was not that salient in the first moments of European integration, where you're able to point to values such as, yes, solidarity. So the development, the contribution that Christian democracy had to the welfare state, for example, was very, very important. But this focus on the economic dimension of left-right, so the correction of inequalities from an economic point of view, a social point of view, maybe underestimate certain positions on the cultural dimension. That was my second point. my third point is about the territorial differences within Europe, because I mean, I looked at them. There is convergence in the party programs. I mean, even by taking simply the comparative manifesto projects and looking where national parties of the same family, Christian Democrats or socialists or liberals or Greens, where do they stand? And you look at them over time, and you can do that for much longer than just the end of the 70s. There is a convergence. There is a clear convergence of these positions. And in this sense, there is a Europeanization of the contents of these parties. And I think it is important to link it to, I mean, I don't want to attempt to explain why there is this convergence, diffusion effects and so on and so forth, but certainly the possibility to have a common position at the European level is also a consequence of this conversion that takes place at the national level. I leave it at 3, but I would have more.
Okay, next time. I will leave the answer on values to Jacopo, who is much more prepared on these aspects, especially when it comes to Christian democracy. I will start by answering the point on the how to look at the data. Well, I didn't have the time to really trace the evolution of some of those indicators, but for at least 6, probably 7 terms, increasing fragmentation at national level meant declining fragmentation at a European level. So it is not a direct reflection of what happens at national level. And the other thing that that the table shows actually is that let me show you.
We don't have that much time, man. 2 minutes.
Just one moment.
Yeah.
You know, you made very long points. I have to answer at least part of them. As you can see here, okay, elections create, column 1 indicates that elections create fragmentation in the European Parliament. Look at 1989, 1994, okay? But then during the term, the system shows enough resilience and ability to counter the fragmentation caused at national level to respond by reducing the number of party groups. So this is something we have looked at. I didn't have time to present it today, but that's something that shows a difference at European level with respect to national level. Then on the territorial difference, how this is in reality a reflection of what happens at national level, and how thinking alike could come from convergences at national level, I agree. But you know, I didn't go into the causal relationship in the trends I was experiencing. This is not the kind of book that calls for that. But yeah, I agree. And then the rest, I think, has to do with the values. Oh yeah, the model of democracy, consociational. It is true to an extent that the consociational dynamics really only involve 3 or 4 groups. Other groups are left out, which in a normal consociational system would not be exactly what you would expect to see. The extreme notion of the cartel party view works in terms of the official story. The don't method to attribute positions is something that is shared by everybody. But then when it comes to the crunch, and there are some differences, as was the case in one of the examples I produced in the book, let's say non-core groups are penalized. Jacopo, on values.
Yes, maybe very quickly I can make 2 points. Though I agree, Daniele, that it's something that should be could warrant a wider study. But the 2 points are: yes, you are right. I can't. Wait just a minute. I lost you all. Okay. Yes, you are right that sometimes it seems uncritical, or at least the mention is of very general values. But we have to understand that one specific feature of the Christian democratic political culture is that less ideologically structured than others. But at the same time, this means that it's more flexible and also, by the way, expandable in political negotiations. So, of course, Christian democratic political culture doesn't have the monopoly over values like, the democracy, solidarity, and civil liberties. But it shares. In particular with other universalistic cultures like the liberal or the socialist, some values that can also can be a sort of bridge towards other political cultures. But of course, you're right in saying that it has historically it has had a very complicated relationship with some core feature of liberal democracy. If you think about the Catholic culture, of course, especially before the Second World War, and in a sense, Christian Democrats helped in making change also the Catholic culture. So it's something that it's not unidirectional in this sense. But the second point is linked to this. And of course, the historical evolution didn't stop with the beginning of European integration. And something that it's interesting to study right now is how, in particular, religious symbols are being appropriated by political cultures that doesn't have religious features or links to Christian democratic background. Like I'm thinking to populist parties, not only from Eastern Europe, but how, if you think, for instance, to the concept of the Christian roots of Europe, this is something that has been widely debated, in particular in the Constitutional Treaty. And it's one thing that if you link the Christian roots of Europe to these general features of a Christian democratic political cultures of the founding fathers, let's say, to use a much used expression. But it's another thing if you link the Christian roots of Europe as some kind of cultural identity markers that don't have much to do with this cultural background, but have to do with oppositional cultures, in particular to the juxtaposition between Christian Europe and Islam, of course, with all this kind of directions. Of course, that Olivier Roy has written a very interesting book about this, and this is something that it's worth exploring to give more meaning and more content to this values aspect that we just touched upon in this book.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you very much. So it is past 2 p.m. and the seminar has to come to an end. But thank you very, very much again, Jacopo and Luciano, for a very stimulating session and for discussing your book with us. It has been a pleasure. And thank you everyone for attending. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks' time and we will have a different type of seminar, a conversation for the future of Europe. And it will be about post-national conception of citizenship and how this inspires the conference on the future of the European Union. And the guest speaker will be Ulrike Geho. So hopefully I see many of you again in 2 weeks' time for another interesting session. Thank you very much again. Have a good rest of the day, a good rest of the week, and bye-bye.
Bye.